At 8:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, February 22nd, 2026, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stood at a podium in Brussels and confirmed what multiple sources had been reporting since late yesterday evening. Canada has formally requested that NATO activate Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the provision that allows member states to request consultations when they believe their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. This is only the seventh time in NATO's 77-year history that Article 4 has been invoked, and it is the first time it has ever been invoked by a member state, citing concerns about another NATO member. Canada is not naming the United States explicitly in its formal request, but every diplomat, every defense analyst, and every journalist covering this story understands exactly what Canada is saying. Canada is telling NATO that it feels threatened by the current US administration's rhetoric and actions, and it wants the alliance to formally discuss what that means for collective security. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is not diplomatic theatre. This is Canada activating the most serious consultation mechanism available in the Western Defense Alliance, and the implications for US-NATO relations for North American security and for the entire post-World War II order are staggering. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Article 4 means and why Canada's invocation of it is so unprecedented. I'm going to reveal what Canada is specifically requesting from NATO in terms of defense consultations and potential support. I'm going to show you the reactions from other NATO members and why many are quietly supporting Canada's move. I'm going to explain why this puts the United States in an impossible position where defending itself makes the situation worse. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for where NATO goes from here, including the nightmare scenario where the alliance fractures and the Western security architecture collapses. Subscribe to join the community. Leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video if it brought you value. Let me explain what Article 4 actually is, because most people have heard of Article 5, NATO's collective defense provision. But Article 4 is less well known and in some ways more significant. Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that member countries will consult together whenever any member feels that their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. It doesn't trigger automatic military response the way Article 5 does. What it does is require NATO to hold formal consultations, to take the threat seriously, and to discuss what the alliance should do about it. Article 4 has been invoked only 6 times before. Turkey invoked it in 2003 before the Iraq War. Turkey invoked it again in 2012 during the Syrian civil war. Poland and other Eastern European members invoked it in 2014 after Russia's annexation of Crimea. Turkey invoked it in 2015 after border incidents with Syria. And Turkey invoked it in 2020 after the Syrian regime killed Turkish soldiers. Every previous invocation was about external threats, Russia, Syria, regional instability. Canada's invocation is fundamentally different because the threat Canada is citing is not external. It's the United States. Here's what Canada's formal request to NATO says. And I'm going to read key sections because the language is carefully chosen. The request states, "The Government of Canada requests consultations under Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty concerning developments that threaten Canada's security and stability within the North Atlantic area." Specifically, Canada seeks consultations regarding statements and actions by a NATO member state that question Canada's sovereignty, threaten Canada's economic security, and propose the dismantling of bilateral defense agreements that are foundational to North American security. The request does not name the United States, but it references Trump's Truth Social posts suggesting Canadian provinces should join the United States and his threats to review the NORAD agreement. The request continues, Canada believes these developments represent an unprecedented challenge to the principles of mutual respect and collective security that underpin the NATO alliance. Canada requests that NATO members consult on how the alliance should respond when member states take actions that threaten other members. The request then outlines three specific asks. First, Canada wants NATO to issue a formal statement reaffirming the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states and condemning any statements or actions that question those principles. Second, Canada wants NATO defense planning committees to review the security implications of instability in North American defense arrangements and to discuss contingency planning if NORAD is weakened or dissolved. Third, Canada wants to explore whether NATO can provide supplementary intelligence sharing and defense coordination to offset potential reductions in US-Canada cooperation. These are not small asks. Canada is essentially requesting that NATO choose between reaffirming Canada's sovereignty, which implicitly condemns Trump's statements, or staying silent, which would signal that NATO tolerates threats between member states. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the evidence that other NATO members are supporting Canada's request, and that the United States is becoming isolated within its own alliance. Receipt number 1. The UK position. British Defence Secretary John Healey released a statement this morning saying, "The United Kingdom supports Canada's request for Article 4 consultations. All NATO members deserve to have their sovereignty respected. The UK believes these consultations are necessary and appropriate." That is Britain, America's closest military ally, publicly backing Canada's position against the United States. Receipt number 2. The European response. France, Germany, and the Netherlands issued a joint statement saying, "We support Article 4 consultations and believe the alliance must address any actions that create uncertainty about mutual respect among members." That's 3 major European NATO powers siding with Canada. Receipt number 3. The Eastern European calculation. Poland, the Baltic states, and other Eastern European members are in a difficult position. They depend on US military presence to deter Russia, so they're reluctant to openly criticize Washington. But privately, according to diplomatic sources, they're telling other NATO members that if the United States can threaten Canada's sovereignty, what stops the US from abandoning Eastern Europe when it's inconvenient? Their security guarantees from Washington suddenly feel less reliable. Poland's foreign minister gave a carefully worded statement saying, "Poland supports dialogue within NATO on all security matters and that the principle of sovereignty applies to all members equally." That's diplomatic language for "we're with Canada, but we can't say it loudly." Receipt number 4. Turkey's position. Turkey, which has invoked Article 4 more than any other country, released a statement saying, "Turkey understands Canada's concerns and supports the consultation process." Turkey and the US have had their own tensions over the years, and Turkey sees Canada's move as validation that Article 4 is an appropriate tool for members to use when they feel threatened by any source, including other members. Here's why this puts the United States in an impossible position. If the US participates in the Article 4 consultations and takes them seriously, it's implicitly acknowledging that Canada has legitimate concerns about US behavior. That means Trump's threats and rhetoric were serious enough to constitute a threat to an ally, which undermines US credibility across the entire alliance. If the US refuses to participate or dismisses the consultations as illegitimate, it's rejecting the NATO treaty framework and signaling that the US doesn't believe alliance rules apply to it. That drives other members closer to Canada and further from the US. If the US tries to block the consultations, which it could theoretically do since NATO operates on consensus, it proves Canada's point that the US is acting as a threat rather than a partner. There is no good option for Washington. Every response makes the situation worse. Here's what happened in the hours after NATO confirmed Canada's Article 4 request. The White House issued a statement at 9:47 a.m. calling the request absurd and offensive. The statement said, "The United States has been the backbone of NATO for 77 years. We have defended our allies, funded the alliance, and provided security that has kept Europe and North America safe. Canada's request is a political stunt designed to distract from their failing economy and weak leadership. The US will not dignify this nonsense with serious engagement." That response was immediately criticized by NATO diplomats as tone-deaf and counterproductive. By calling Canada's request absurd, the US is dismissing legitimate alliance procedures. By refusing to engage seriously, the US is signaling it doesn't respect NATO's decision-making processes. At 11:15 a.m., the Pentagon issued its own statement that was notably different in tone from the White House statement. The Pentagon said, "The Department of Defense values its partnership with Canada and with all NATO allies. We are committed to North American defense and to the NATO alliance. We will participate constructively in any consultations requested under NATO treaty provisions." That's the Pentagon directly contradicting the White House. The military understands that Canada's concerns about NORAD and defense cooperation are serious, and that dismissing them threatens US national security. The split between the Pentagon and the White House tells you that even within the US government, there's no consensus on how to handle this. Congressional reaction has been divided along the same lines as yesterday's vote. The 12 Republican senators who voted against Trump's Canada policy released a joint statement saying, "We support NATO consultations and believe the alliance should address concerns raised by any member. Canada is a vital ally and deserves to be heard." Democratic leaders went further. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, "Canada's Article 4 request is a direct result of the president's reckless rhetoric. This administration has damaged our most important alliance and undermined our national security. The president should apologize to Canada and to NATO." Here's what Canada is actually trying to achieve with this move, and it's more strategic than it might appear. Canada knows that Article 4 consultations won't result in NATO taking military action or imposing sanctions on the United States. That's not the point. The point is to internationalize the US-Canada dispute and to make it a NATO-wide issue rather than a bilateral problem. By invoking Article 4, Canada forces every NATO member to take a position. Do they support the principle that member states' sovereignty must be respected, or do they stay silent and implicitly endorse Trump's threats? Most NATO members will choose to support sovereignty because if they don't, their own sovereignty becomes questionable. Every statement of support Canada gets from NATO members strengthens Canada's position and weakens the US position. Canada is also preparing for a post-Trump future. If Trump loses the 2026 midterms or the 2028 election, Canada wants a paper trail showing that it stood up for alliance principles while the US under Trump violated them. That makes it easier for future US administrations to repair the relationship by distancing themselves from Trump's actions. Let me give you 3 scenarios for where this goes. Scenario 1. The alliance pressure forces a US retreat. NATO holds Article 4 consultations over the next 2 weeks. During those consultations, member after member expresses support for Canada and concern about US rhetoric. The political pressure becomes overwhelming. Trump, facing isolation within NATO and rebellion from Senate Republicans, agrees to issue a statement saying he never intended to question Canada's sovereignty and that NORAD will continue without changes. Carney accepts the statement as sufficient. The consultations conclude with a NATO declaration reaffirming member sovereignty. The crisis de-escalates. but US credibility within NATO is permanently damaged. Scenario 2. The alliance splits. The US refuses to take the consultation seriously. Trump doubles down on his rhetoric. NATO members split into two camps: those who prioritize the transatlantic relationship with the US and reluctantly stay quiet, and those who prioritize alliance principles and support Canada. The alliance becomes paralyzed by internal division. Future NATO decisions require choosing between US and Canadian positions. The effectiveness of NATO as a unified defense organization collapses. Russia and China exploit the division to advance their interests, knowing the West can no longer coordinate effectively. Scenario 3. The Canadian realignment. During Article 4 consultations, European NATO members offer Canada increased defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and security guarantees that are explicitly separate from USC arrangements. Canada begins to reorient its defense relationships toward Europe and away from the US. Canada increases defense spending to reduce dependence on American capabilities. Over time, Canada becomes more of a European-aligned NATO member than a North American one. The US loses its most important geographic ally and faces a strategic environment where its northern border is no longer reliably friendly. This scenario takes years to fully materialize, but it begins with these consultations. I'm watching whether NATO schedules formal Article 4 consultations within the next week, whether any additional NATO members issue public statements supporting Canada, and whether Trump makes any attempt to soften his rhetoric on Canada's sovereignty. Canada just told NATO that it feels threatened by the United States. That sentence should be impossible. The US and Canada have been the closest of allies for over a century, but it's happening. And how NATO responds will determine whether the alliance survives this crisis intact, or whether we're watching the beginning of the end of the Western security